Alright, we should be recording now. Hello everyone. This is for Psych 100 class, the Monday class. On November 3rd we had to cancel. I am stuck here at my house. So we were going to finish chapter 7 and start chapter 8. I think when we're catching up next week we will go over chapter 8 and chapter 9. So what I'm going to do now is do a mini lecture on the rest of chapter 7 that we hadn't gotten to last week after our test. So I'm going to focus on a couple of the more difficult concepts and then kind of skip over some of the other slides. If you haven't already downloaded the slides from Blackboard, go ahead and do that now. This is for chapter 7. It should be under the October 27th course content page. So you can download the slides and then kind of watch them along. We did get about halfway through. I'm going to start here on heuristics. That is on the slide number 26, which is under the implementing strategies and evaluating progress. So it's in problem solving basically in that portion of the chapter. You'll remember that earlier in this chapter we had talked about different types of thought, we talked about language, we talked about the way that we think, all these different images and words and the kind of metacognition issues that we have in figuring out how it is that we understand our own thoughts and think about thinking. Now moving into problem solving, we did talk a little bit, I believe, about problem representation and also developing strategies in order to solve problems. And that's where heuristics falls under. So if you're on slide 26 now, heuristics is basically rules of thumb. So these are the quick strategies that we implement whenever we have a problem that we are trying to face or trying to solve. Rules of thumb are very useful to us because if we had to start from scratch every single time we were faced with a problem, and especially every time we were faced with a problem that was similar to other problems that we had solved before, we would be wasting so much time and so much cognitive power. However, we kind of develop these kind of quick ways to think about, this is what I'm going to do if this sort of problem arises. A couple of types of heuristics that we use are hill climbing, which is this idea that we have one large, huge, long-term goal, but we can't solve it in just one step or in one push or one goal. And so what we're going to do is kind of break it up into, well, we have like sub-goals, which is an intermediate, more manageable goals that add up to or that may take us closer to that ultimate goal. Or also with hill climbing, just thinking about it with every action that we do, we want to take ourselves one step closer to getting that ultimate solution. So these are different ways that we kind of think about heuristics. Moving to the next slide, the means-end analysis is one of the heuristics. It's also commonly used in our culture, especially. We do think about, if we kind of backward map from the goal, what are all of the things that we have to do in order to meet that goal, and are all of these steps that we have to take worth the ultimate thing that we are achieving? Now, a lot of you may have thought about this kind of means-end analysis when you decided to go to school, for example, figuring out, okay, what are the opportunities that are going to be available to me at the end of this process, and is the process itself worth all of these opportunities that are going to be opening up to me? So that's an example of a means-end analysis, which is a type of heuristic that we use. You can pause the video for a second now and think to yourself, what are some of these quick heuristics that I have when I'm trying to reach a goal? What are the rules of thumb, the heuristics that I use to solve common problems that arise in my day or in my life? So moving into obstacles, this is on slide 28. You'll see that there are a number of different obstacles that may occur actually within ourselves, within our psychology, or within human psychology that can impede problem solving. And this is not all problems, but it may be for certain types of problems, certain types of thinking or certain psychology doesn't quite fit. So for example, with various mental sets, we have a tendency at times to perceive and approach problems in certain ways that can actually interfere with the problem solution. For example, with functional fixedness, we have a tendency to perceive that there are only a limited number of ways to use a certain object. So it is functionally meant for this one use, and therefore we have this fixed belief that it can only be used for this one thing. I have noticed this throughout my travels. This is very common in developed nations where we do have one object for each task, basically. We have so many different types of objects. You go to a developing nation and people are going to use a saw for a hammer if they have a saw and they need a hammer, and just basically be very creative with the objects around them. But this is not only in that literal sense of an object that can only be used for this, but also we can think of it in a figurative way. So a functional fixedness of our relationships, people that we have in our lives. I think of this person as a mentor. I would never think of them as a friend because I have fixed them functionally in that role as mentor rather than in a role as friend, and I'm not necessarily ever going to cross those boundaries. Moving forward now, we're going to go down to decision making on slide number 30. This will be a type of problem solving. So it's very similar to the other problem solving that we've talked about, but decision making is specifically when we do have known possible solutions and we have to choose one. And basically any one of the solutions could be correct. It's not like there's only one answer and we're trying to find the one answer. But we have multiple options and we have to pick one of them, knowing that each of these different options is going to lead us in a different path. Decision making, therefore, can be very complex, and we're going to talk too in a minute about how complex it can be. Okay, so going into slide 31, we have our compensatory decision making, and this is basically our rational decision making model that we all like to think that we always do, and of course we don't always do, but especially in very important decisions, this is going to be our ultimate goal, is to have this kind of like systematic evaluation of all possible choices and decide which is going to be the best one among all of these. However, we do have a tendency to use shortcuts or heuristics, rules of thumb, in order to decrease the complexity of decision making. So some people might say, I have all of these options before me, I have to do one of these things, I'm going to go with what feels right in my gut. And so that will be a way to simplify within my personal tendency whatever the decision is, or I'll leave it to God and see what happens, or whatever feels right in my heart, or something that would make my mama proud, or any of these different things. Like, we do have ways that we simplify very complex choices that we make. So even when we are rationally thinking about and evaluating all possible options, we do have personal tendencies within this rationality. Moving down to slide number 32, so we have decision-making heuristics, some of the very common ones that we use. Probably each of us has used all of these in various decisions that we've made. We have our representativeness, so basically we judge a new situation based on things that we have experienced before. Now, the terminology that is used here is we are judging our new situation on the basis of its resemblance to a stereotypical model. You'll remember from chapter 14 when we were talking about stereotypes and schemas. These are our perceptions of how something should work. And so we are representing in our minds, this is how something should work, and if it works similarly to a stereotype or a schema that I have developed before, then I'm going to apply my decision making accordingly to what I have done before, what I've experienced before, and the outcomes that I've seen before. So again, this is a very intelligent way for us to think. We don't want to start everything from scratch and from new. We want to base our new decisions based on previous experiences. We also have availability. Now this can be basing our judgment on information that is readily available to us at the time, even knowing that there might be more information out there, but either we just don't have time or we don't have the inclination for whatever reason to wait for the more information, or availability as in whatever it is that I can remember right now. So sometimes this can be good because it just helps us make a decision and we move on. Sometimes we might be kicking ourselves because later, oh, I forgot about this other thing that I experienced before, and so that can cause some issues too. Either way, decision is made, right? And then we also have confirmation bias. This is actually very common among people. We have our schemas, we have our stereotypes, we have our expectations for reality. And a lot of times when new evidence is coming in, we kind of discount the evidence that doesn't exactly fit in with our schema, and instead we look to the evidence that makes most sense to us, that fits in well with our experience of reality, and that will be our confirmation bias. So we're looking for things that say, yes, this is the right decision to make, because I already kind of thought that might be the right decision to make anyway. Slide 33, we have framing. This will be the perspective from which we interpret our decision and the information within our decision. Framing is very important. We see from where we stand. So the experiences that we have had before, also the things that are important to us, that we value, all of this will help us frame our decision. And this might fit in with heuristics, or it might even fit in with our compensatory decision making, where we're trying to think of everything very rationally and logically. Either way, we're still going to be seeing from our own perspective, and the way that we frame the ultimate decision can have an awful lot of influence on the decision we actually go with. On slide 34, you will see hindsight bias. Everyone has experienced this. We even have a saying for it, hindsight is 20/20. And this is this idea where we're working so hard to make a decision, we're kind of caught up in the moment, we're seeing things as they are, and as they are now, things are uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen next. However, when what happens next happens, we think, oh, of course, I knew that was going to happen. I should have seen that coming. Why didn't I blah, blah, blah? Well, it's because of this hindsight bias, this idea that after we have seen something happen, it becomes so obvious it should have been predictable. Of course, the reality is it wasn't predictable. That's why we didn't predict it. So always cut yourself some slack with our hindsight is 20/20. We also have counterfactual thinking, and this is a very important psychological concept. This is when we think about alternative realities and things that never really happened. I made choice A, I didn't make choice B, but if I had made choice B, maybe things would have gone like this, and maybe it would have been such and such, and would have been these outcomes, and these are the things that I'm missing out on because I didn't choose choice B. As thinking beings, we have the ability to always go through and think about what didn't happen and what might have happened. But we actually experience some level of kind of like psychological distress because of this counterfactual thinking. We are thinking about things that didn't happen, that will never happen. And we feel kind of lost because we didn't get to experience those as well because we made the opposite choice. Now moving on to slide 35, I have a cover here of a book called The Paradox of Choice. This is by Barry Schwartz. It's a really excellent book and I highly recommend it to everyone. But it's basically the idea behind this book is that having choice and having control over our lives is psychologically healthy. And in fact, it is pretty necessary for our health and well-being, both physical health and our psychological health as well. We know that in like elderly care homes, that people who have more choice in their daily lives live longer and are healthier, are happier, and have like better relationships if they have these choices over their daily lives rather than if everything is guided and scripted for them. Choice is very important. Having power in your life is very important. However, because of counterfactual thinking, we're constantly considering, what would it have been if I had had this for lunch instead of this? What would it have been like if I had dated this person instead of this person? What would it have been like if I'd moved to this city instead of this city? we have, in large and small ways, constantly throughout our days, and sometimes extending for years within our lives, this sense of loss for things that we didn't choose, things that we didn't experience because we went another way. And so that means that every choice we make is somewhat tempered by the loss of choices we didn't make, which can be very difficult and actually kind of damaging to us. We live in a society now, this book especially makes the point, that we have so many choices in our day-to-day lives that this accumulated counterfactual thinking does actually cause a lot of stress and even distress within our lives. So it's very important to consider this, now that we know about it and can think about it, is that when we make a choice, a lot of times, especially if it's a choice that it doesn't matter what we had for lunch, these little things that do add up, just make the choice and move on, and be aware that we can't always get the absolute best outcome, but psychologically speaking, sometimes just getting something that is good enough and moving on with our lives is the perfect way to go about things. Okay, let's move down to slide 36. In slide 36, we are talking about multitasking, and this can be with our digital technology. We are constantly connected to glowing rectangular screens. I'm staring at one right now, talking to all of you. You're staring at one too. But basically, we have this ability within our technological society to constantly be in connection and communication with other people, which is great in some ways, but that also means that we have a lot less downtime. We can, in fact, always be working. I can be stuck at my house and still be teaching, for example. But these sorts of things can, divide our attention. We've talked about this before. Now, the idea with multitasking, really efficient, effective multitasking, is not paying attention to multiple things at once. We've talked about before how we're actually really bad at doing that, and we think that means that we're putting more attention to both of the things that we're working on, when really we're not. In order to be a really efficient and effective multitasker, and for a lot of our jobs we have to do this, is to train ourselves to turn our 100% full attention to this task that I'm working on, and as soon as that's done, to move on to this task 100% that I'm working on, and not let our attention be divided, because that actually is really harmful, and we're not so good at it. Our brains are terrible liars. Okay, we're going to go through intelligence now pretty quickly. I want to just touch on a little bit these different theories of intelligence that we have. Now, early theorists, and it was very important, this is on slide 38, did have this sense that intelligence was just this one thing, and you had it or you didn't have it. And of course, it's very important that we had these early theorists to kind of develop a sense of intelligence and things that we could work on, but we've moved really far beyond that since then. We can go down to slide 39, Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence, which is basically that our mental skills equals analytic intelligence. Our insight and creative adaptability will be our creative intelligence, and our environmental responsiveness, and remember, environment means our social environment as well, the place where we are and the things and people that are around us, that will be our practical intelligence. Which, of course, we can see these things may or may not be connected with each other. One person may be really high in creative intelligence, really low in analytic intelligence, really high in practical intelligence, really low in creative intelligence. They may or may not overlap. So Gardner's theory is that there is not one intelligence, but there are many, and I believe he came up with 8, and there was another 9th or 10th that were added after that. Going down to slide 41, we have Goleman's theory, which is basically that within emotional intelligence, we need to have the ability to perceive the emotions of others. We need to have the ability to perceive and understand the emotions that we ourselves are experiencing, because that's how we can then control them appropriately. And if we are lacking in our ability to either understand, sense, and express our own emotions, or if we are lacking in the ability to understand and sense and react to other people's emotions, then we are lacking in emotional intelligence. And that emotional intelligence is actually a really strong predictor of success in life, because we are social animals. We work with people constantly, and people who are not very responsive to other people's emotions or other people's states of being are going to struggle with getting along with people. So emotional intelligence is definitely one that we want to work on. The Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, this is on slide 42, was developed specifically to measure how well children were doing in school, and to identify children who might struggle in school because they might need extra services in order to help them succeed. That was what it was designed for. People, non-scientists, not Stanford Binet, were so kind of enthralled with this idea of the intelligence quotient that they started applying it wholeheartedly, just all across everything, and things that it was never meant to be applied to. We did have actually a number of truly terrible instances of this application. We had immigrants who are coming into the country being tested with this IQ test. If they did not pass in English, then they were dubbed morons or imbeciles. They might be sent back out of the country. We had people in homes, in hospitals, who were forcibly sterilized against their will because they had a low IQ. We had prisoners also. We have a pretty rough history of this. As a matter of fact, the laws that were passed by Hitler in Nazi Germany were based on laws that were already in place in the United States. We do have a bad history with this. This is no longer happening. However, it's not too far in our past. I think it was in the 1970s when the last person was forcibly sterilized in the United States against their will due to low intelligence scores. So, a little bit of our rough history. Basically within our intelligence test though, and this is for the Stanford Binet and also in the Wechsler intelligence test, you'll see on slide 43, that the average IQ will be put at 100. People who have 2 standard deviations up will be considered like exceptionally intelligent, genius level, and people who are 2 standard deviations down will be considered as having intellectual disability and some sort of typically cognitive or developmental impairment that they had experienced that is keeping them from functioning, I guess, at the more average rate. However, it's also important to note that intelligence, again, is not the only predictor of how well a person will do in life. There are plenty of people who are very highly intelligent who don't really amount to much, and other people who don't have very much intelligence who nevertheless do pretty amazing things. You will see on slide 45 and again on slide 46 we are talking about the different ways to measure reliability of a test. So a good test will be highly reliable, which would mean that it produces consistent test scores across time. So if I take this test now and then I take this test again next year, I'm not going to change that much, and that means that it's a reliable test. So you have good test, retest, reliability. On the other hand, we have, going down to slide 47, validity, which is the ability of the test to measure what it says it measures. So if we want to put multiple measures against each other and they seem to both be measuring the same thing, and we have good reason to believe that they are measuring actually what they say they are measuring, that would be validity. Validity is different than reliability, and I know these can be kind of complicated terms, so please take a few minutes to make sure that you have those two square in your head. They might come up again. So in slide 48 you will see once again about the controversy of IQ tests, which is basically that a lot of psychologists will say that what we are actually measuring with our IQ tests is not generalized intelligence, but instead it's a very specific type of intelligence, culturally specific for a certain type of success and achievement in our country or in our society. Also that emotional intelligence specifically is very good at predicting real-world success. So there's ongoing discussion, and I think there will continue to be ongoing discussion on this topic of how much can we consider IQ to be a valid and useful measure. However, right now, you guys know better than any, going through school, standardized tests are very common. We have that all the way through elementary, high school, college, and guess what, if you go into grad school, still have it then. I'm just going to touch on these next few slides that we do know that heredity, environment, both have influence on intelligence. So with slide 51, you can see that twin studies have helped us to understand that there is definitely some sort of hereditary biological genetic component. On slide 52, you can see that twins who are reared together down at the bottom of this graph have a very high rate of connection, whereas identical twins reared apart just above that, also very high, but not quite as high, so we're seeing definitely some environmental influence there. However, we also know that environment does play a major role, moving down to slide 53. So for example, socioeconomic status, or SES, this would be the class, how much money someone has, what opportunities were available to them as they were being raised. Prenatal nutrition, also early childhood nutrition, are very important for brain development. Anyone who takes developmental psychology next semester will get to talk about that in a lot of depth, how very important intelligence is. And then also our level of environmental stimulation, so how exciting our environments, how much brain growth do we have the opportunity to take part in because of the place where we are at. Head Start programs and other like preschool and early childhood programs are very important for this because we know that early nutrition but also early stimulation are very important for increasing and encouraging cognitive development. So these things are have been very highly successful in our country. In slide 55, we will see, I want to point out the Flynn effect. So the Flynn effect is basically as a society is introduced to intelligence testing, at first it's a weird thing. Why are you doing the standardized test in order to detect intelligence? But as societies get more used to the idea of the test and the ways that we are tested, they get smarter according to the tests. They start scoring better. So even just the idea of having this sort of testing in our schools or in our society increases our ability, our practice, I guess, at doing these sorts of things. And so overall the test scores will raise. Which again is another one of the considerations that number one, test designers have to keep in mind, because if a society is constantly having a shifting norm, that means that they have to change their tests accordingly. But also psychologists who are questioning the validity of the test will say, well, if you can get better at the test just because you are used to having tests in your society, are they actually measuring what they mean to measure? In the mental abilities across gender and culture, on slide 56, you'll see that there's no significant difference in most cognitive abilities between males and females. There are some gender differences in math, verbal skills, and visual spatial abilities. However, I do want to qualify this with some research that is out there, which is basically 100 years ago there was this idea that girls were much better at math and boys were much better at verbal abilities. And guess what? Testing proved that was absolutely the case, that girls were better at math and boys were better at verbal abilities. However, now we have the opposite cultural belief that boys are better at math and girls are better at verbal abilities, and guess what our tests show now? That boys are better at math and girls are better at verbal abilities. So I have to wonder how much of this is kind of a social and cultural impact as well, that we expect certain outcomes of ourselves and of each other, and then we kind of create these outcomes. I don't know, but I do know that there's question. So always question of how much of it is actual biology and how much of it is social setting. We will move on to creativity. Let's go to slide 60. Creativity is defined as our ability to produce novel and socially valued ideas or objects. So coming up with something new that has not been come up with before. There is question about how much we can connect intelligence with creativity. Are these the same thing, or are these not the same thing? And that again goes back to our previous conversations of multiple types of intelligence, and that maybe you can be smart in some ways and less smart in other ways. Measuring creativity can be very difficult because creativity involves original responses. So how do you test something if you don't want to get the same response from multiple people because you want them to come up with something new? It's a conundrum. But never to be thwarted, we have to move forward with that. So on slide 62, you can see that there's these few different types of creative intelligence or creative thinking tests. So we have the Torrance test, the Christensen-Guilford, the Remote Associates test, and Walsh and Kogan Creative Battery. And so I pulled a couple of different measures from online, also from my childhood, and so you can see on on slide 63, there are 9 dots, and what I want you to do, take your time, because I'm not going to tell you during this video what the answer is, but you want to draw 4 straight lines without lifting your pen from the paper. 4 straight lines, and with those, cover all 9 dots. That is your goal for this test. On slide 64, this is something that I was presented with when I was a kid, and it still just fascinates me. So this is 2 sentences. I want you to punctuate them. We have Jim where Bill had was right. And yes, it can be grammatically correct, and yes, I will tell you how later. But yeah, that's my only hint, is it is actually 2 sentences. And on slide 65, this is one more measure of creativity, where we will put together 3 words in clusters, and there is one word that ties all 3 of these words together. And so the creative job is to figure out how do these 3 things connect to each other. And so have fun, look up some more creative tests, because they're fun to do, and I will see you all in class next week, and have a great week. Alright.